All right. Let me begin with a few quick announcements before I begin my lecture for today. So, reminder that papers are due day after tomorrow, and they're due at the beginning of class. So be sure that you come on time and hand me your paper in at that time. Secondly, there's a holiday next Tuesday. So I just want to remind you there'll be no class a week from today. It's Veterans Day. Thirdly, I was just asked a question, and I think that this is a useful point at which I can make a comment about it. You know, can you use lecture notes for writing your paper? So if you look at the instructions, it says very clearly that you should not be using lecture notes for citation. So for example, you cannot give me a citation which is Vinay Lal lecture of October 15th. That's not a citation. You can cite me if you're using a published work of mine, just as you would cite anyone else. Okay, and there are obviously a few readings of mine here. There are other readings of mine outside which are not included in the syllabus, needless to say. So you can certainly use those, and you can use the lectures to inform your understanding of the material, but you shouldn't be basing your entire paper, for example, on a lecture that I might have given and then just repeating verbatim what was mentioned in the lecture. That will not be acceptable. Okay? I just want to make sure that you understand this matter clearly. Now, what I'm going to talk to you about today is politics in India. This is something that I'd started talking to you about in my previous lecture. I'm not entirely certain we're going to get done with it today. And if you look at the syllabus, it may look like we're quite far behind, but we're not really, because there are portions of subsequent lectures for reasons that I've described to you before, namely that all of these subjects obviously intersect with each other in crucial ways. I mean, if you look at the question of caste, which is what I'd been talking to you about in my previous lecture, and I'm going to continue from there today before I move on to other matters, that if you look at the subject of caste, obviously it intersects with the question of politics, economy, society, right? Social change. All of these questions intersect with the question of caste. So and even though we can obviously put the question of caste in one segment, and that's what I've done for the question of Dalits. Dalits being people who belong to the lowest rung of Indian society, as you're going to find out in just a few minutes, that there are questions which have to do with, well, how does one locate them within the project of democracy? And in that case, obviously, it means that we have to go back to the question of politics, right? Or there might be questions about, well, how does one locate them within the question of social advancement, economic advancement? What are the reservations policies that India has? And so when you do that, then you obviously move back into the question of economy. What is your place in the economy? What kinds of legislative reforms have been undertaken by the Indian state that might enable the Dalits to rise, right, beyond the level at which they are at the present moment? So just keep in mind that these questions continue to intersect with each other, and obviously, as I've said, it may look like we're about a lecture and a half behind, but we'll be caught up. I've had enough experience doing this over the last 20 years that I know exactly what is entailed when we start to look at some of these questions and where we are in the syllabus at the present moment. So in my concluding remarks to you on Tuesday or on Thursday, what I've been talking to you about was the Indian caste system, and I want to just remind you of what I had mentioned, that if you look at the ancient texts, what do? They basically divide Indian society, and here we're speaking of pre-Muslim India. We are speaking of the point at which caste becomes entrenched in Indian society is not entirely clear, but we could say it's probably sometime before, sometime around 1,000 years before Christ. Okay, so roughly about, let's say, 3,000 years ago, give or take a few hundred years. Not entirely certain about that. So you've got Brahmins, and who are the Brahmins? These are people who are the priests, people who preside over the religious tradition. They transmit knowledge from one generation to another. Originally, for a long period of time, in fact, it was done in the oral tradition. And of course, there were pockets of Brahmins. There were Brahmin communities, because when we say Brahmins, we're not speaking about one community. There are many different communities of Brahmins, and they're subcastes, as they're called, right? The word caste itself, by the way, is not an Indian word. It's a Portuguese word. Okay, it's a Portuguese word. one of the anomalies of studying India is that virtually all the words that we use, such as Hindus, no one in India ever described himself or herself as a Hindu before the 18th century. Okay? When we speak about caste, we are not using an Indian word. This is a Portuguese word. Right? So this is one of the anomalies of studying India, that the categories that we're using, or the words that we're using, principal words, are very often of foreign origin. But be that as it may, this idea of the caste system, and the word that is used, by the way, in Sanskrit texts, the word that would be most commonly used in India is Varna. And what Varna suggests actually is that the caste system is an occupation-based system. So when I mentioned to you the Brahmins, what did I do? I immediately described, well, who they are. I'm not simply translating the term into English. I'm describing what are the different occupations that they might have pursued. So they were family priests, people who are repositories of sacred knowledge, people who in fact actually have been charged with the task of transmitting knowledge from one generation to the other, largely through the oral tradition. And then you've got the Kshatriyas, again a subject on which one could say a great deal, because some historians have argued that the Kshatriyas got wiped out a long time ago. Who were the Kshatriyas? Warriors, high-level administrators, people whose task is the task of governance. And so to that extent, you could say that the Brahmins and the Kshatriyas form a pair. How do they form a pair? Because the Brahmins exercise religious authority, whereas the Kshatriyas exercise political authority. Right? That would be the division of labor, if I may put it this way. And then you've got the Vaishyas. And who are the Vaishyas? People who are entrepreneurs, traders, shopkeepers, merchants. Right? This would be the Vaishyas, and then you have at the bottom of the ladder is the Shudras. And the Shudras, so these three were, the first three castes are very often in the old anthropological literature described as a twice-born castes. That is, that these are people who can in fact actually eventually gain emancipation after going through various cycles of birth and rebirth. The Shudras don't even have that option available to them, so to speak. Who are the Shudras? These are the people who do the dirty labor, okay, the hard labor. So these are the people who pick up garbage from the streets, okay, but they could be landless laborers. They could be landless laborers, so working for a pittance for, let's say, a big landlord, okay, or a rich farmer, so forth and so on. Right? That's the division of labor that is mentioned in the Indian text. Now, here are the complications that you need to think about. Just a few of the complications. There are thousands of complications, but just a few of the major ones that I think that you have to be alert to, because I haven't yet talked about this category of people called the Dalits. And if you look at the syllabus, this is the group of people for whom we have an entire section, a couple of weeks from now. Right? And of course, some of this material is going to be critical to understand that particular section. So, but before I get to the Dalits, let me first make the following distinction, offer the following distinction. This fourfold division is what I am going to call a textbook view. Textbook. That is that, how do we know that there's this fourfold division? Because some ancient texts, such as a text called the Manu Smriti, you don't need to worry about the name of this text, you just try to, you're not going to be tested on something like that. The Manu Smriti is translated into English as the Laws of Manu, a text dated to approximately the 2nd century of the Common Era, so about 1900 years old. All right. So one of the things that Manu does is he enumerates these castes and then points out what are the duties and obligations of each of these castes. Okay? But this is a textbook view. And what do I mean by the textbook view? There are very strict, okay, rules and regulations that guide the relationships between each of these castes, their conduct towards each other. So the Brahmins can be easily polluted or contaminated. They're the purest, and the purer you are, the greater the number of sources that can actually contaminate you. Right? And of course, the bottom down you are the latter. So when you get to the Shudras, these are the people who in fact contaminate the upper castes. And when I say contamination, what would be an illustration? Manu even says in his law book that when a Brahmin is walking down a street and a Shudra is coming from the other side, that the Shudra should ring a bell to announce his presence. Because if even the mere shadow of the Shudra should fall upon the Brahmin will get contaminated. He'll get polluted. And what will the Brahmin have to do then? Then he'll have to go back home, he'll have to take off all of his clothes, discard them, take a shower, purify himself. Okay? And of course, the sources of contamination may be enormous. I'll tell you a case, by the way, which came to my attention because I was called up by this company here in the United States. Okay? And this tells you a little bit about what we mean when we talk about contamination. Okay, so, and I've been hired as a consultant on 15 or 20 of these such cases over the last 10 years. So I got a call from Taco Bell about 6 years ago saying, we've been told that you're an expert on Hinduism. I said, well, yes, to some extent. How can I help you? And they said, well, we've got a case here and we need your assistance. And the case very briefly was an Orthodox Hindu, a Brahmin, had gone to a Taco Bell and had ordered a bean and rice burrito, vegetarian. He got served a beef burrito, and he bit into it, and then realized that he'd eaten meat, and he hadn't just eaten meat; he'd actually eaten beef, because the cow is sacred for Hindus. There's a taboo, as there is a taboo on the consumption of pork for Muslims and Jews. Similarly, there is a taboo on the consumption of beef. So what did this gentleman do? The one who went to Taco Bell and got served a beef burrito, he filed a lawsuit against Taco Bell, and he said that, so I don't remember the exact amount of the lawsuit, but the lawsuit was that, among other things, what he would have to do is he would have to take a week off from work to go to a place called Pushkar. So Pushkar is a very sacred lake in Rajasthan in western India, because this is the only place where he could undergo an act of penance for having consumed beef. Okay? And then he would have to hire a cook to feed 1,001 Brahmins, and so he put up a tab and he said, well, business class to Pushkar, $10,000, feeding 1,001 Brahmins, another $5,000, 1 week off work, that's $2,000 worth, etc., etc. He filed up a $50,000 bill, basically. And so Taco Bell said, this sounds preposterous to us, because, by the way, when he got served that, he objected. So they said, well, we'll give you a coupon for 1 free burrito next time you come in. This is our apology to you. And, of course, this man was infuriated. So that's what it means to be contaminated. Now, I'm not going to get into the intricacies of this particular case. But this is what Manu says. Okay? Now, having said this, you must understand that this is nonetheless a textbook view, because remember what Manu is saying, that the mere shadow of a Shudra coming from a distance of 50 feet away, if it falls upon a Brahmin, he's contaminated. Well, you know what? I lived in Delhi for many years, and I used to use the DTC buses. I mentioned to you the DTC buses in my last lecture. DTC is the Delhi Transport Corporation. So these are the buses on the back of which, back of every seat, they would have a sign saying, eve teasing is strictly prohibited. Okay? Molestation of women is prohibited. And in these buses, which are designed for 60 people, there are about 200 people who are crammed into the bus. And every time you're in that bus, you don't have room to move your elbow. Now, if I'm in that bus, I don't, ask the guy next door, hey, are you a Shudra or not? Because if you are, well, I'm going to be contaminated. Well, you're going to be contaminated anyhow if you're in a DTC bus, right? So what I'm saying to you is this, that this is the textbook view. But life doesn't always correspond to the textbook. In fact, it seldom corresponds to the textbooks, which is one reason why, of course, economics is an absolute disaster, because you've got all these economists with their fantastic models, which are absolutely no correspondence to anything that happens in the world, so long as they can create their own models and do their regressions, So now you've got the textbook view, and then you have what happens on the ground. What happens on the ground? And what happens on the ground is, so Varna is basically describes this system here. This is a system of Varna. And then you have these thousands of subcastes on the ground, jostling for space, intermingling, sometimes not intermingling. And when I say the textbook view, I don't mean to say, of course, that there may not be cases where, in fact, you may have situations where people are, in fact, maintaining, of course, a distance. No one maintains the kind of distance that Manu talks about today. I mean, it would be impossible. All right? But obviously, where do people maintain a distance? They maintain a distance, for example, in terms of marriage. That no matter how progressive you are, the likelihood in India is that if you're a Brahmin, you're going to marry another Brahmin, or certainly an upper caste person. An upper caste person. You're not going to marry a Shudra. And of course, you have to remember that in the system, as is the case in every society, that generally marriages between male Brahmins and women who are Shudras may not be frowned upon as much, for the simple reason that their children, their offspring, will get the caste of the father. However, if a Brahmin woman marries a Shudra man, then all hell breaks loose. Partly because, of course, the children get the status of the mother, of the father. In this case, who do they get the status of, right? If you're talking about a female Brahmin and a male Shudra, they get the status of the father. They become Shudras. Right? So there are these considerations that you have to keep in mind when you think about how the system was perpetuated over the years. Now, who are the Dalits? A great many theories. We don't have time to entertain all of these theories. You know, are they people who were essentially the Shudras, and there was further fragmentation of the Shudras, for example? That's one theory. Right? And probably one of the more predominant theories. That because the texts that go back to remote antiquity do not mention a group of people that we would today designate as Dalits. The word, it's not the word itself, it's the group of people, however you designate them. So for example, during the time of Gandhi, they were known as the untouchables. Okay, and once in a rare while you still hear that word. Gandhi himself called them Harijan, a word that the Dalits found condescending. Harijan means children of God, because what he wanted to convey was the idea that as far as he was concerned, they were just as good as anybody else. That we are all God's children of the world, doesn't matter what color we have, what status we have, so forth and so on. Right? They were also known as the depressed classes, not depressed in the common sense of depressed, but depressed meaning subjugated. Okay? And usually they are referred to, in the official language, they're referred to as the scheduled castes. A term that I actually acquainted you with earlier on, scheduled castes. Why scheduled castes? Because these are people who are listed in an appendix or schedule to the Constitution. Okay? And if you are a member of the scheduled caste, then what does it mean? What it signifies is that you are entitled to certain reservations, certain policies by the state that may be beneficial to you, or what in the United States would be called affirmative action, although the scale of reservations is much, much larger than anything that has ever been witnessed in the United States. And when we get to the section on Dalits, we're going to look a bit more closely at the policy of reservations. Okay? So now, remember the context in which I had started this whole discussion. If I want you to go back to that slide, okay. So that slide I had started out with, where I had said that, look, when we look at the politics in India, what we're interested in is a number of considerations. One of them has to do with what we might call domestic politics, and then we're interested in the relations that India had with neighboring states, and finally what we're interested in is geopolitics on a larger scale. That is India's relations with not just neighboring states, but with countries around India. All right? So one of the things that we had looked at was the integration of Indian states. Then we had looked at the whole question of reorganization of Indian states, electoral reforms and universal franchise, and we had looked at, very briefly, at center-state relations, and then finally we had come to the subject of abolition of untouchability. So what are the measures that the Indian government undertook to eradicate untouchability? I don't know why this is taking so long to come on. Okay, well, maybe now it will. All right, so what are the measures undertaken by the Indian government for the eradication of untouchability? So very briefly, what the Indian government proposed to do. Okay, so this is what we're talking about right now, is abolition of untouchability over here, and I want you to look at the relationship between something called reservations and the issue of caste. So very briefly, a more detailed discussion of this will follow in subsequent weeks. When the Constitution was drafted, the principal drafter of the Constitution, B.R. Ambedkar, a Dalit leader, and that's interesting, that the government of India at the inception of independence assigned the task of drafting the Constitution to a committee, and the head of this committee was a Dalit. Right? And you could say that this was obviously a sign of the fact that the Indian government was seriously committed to the task of the eradication of untouchability. And at that point, if you follow the Constituent Assembly debates, Ambedkar thought that reservations will be needed in India for about 10 years. That within 10 years, it should be possible to take these Dalits and move them into positions not of affluence, but positions whereby you could say that they have been integrated into Indian society and Indian economy as a whole. Okay, now of course we are talking about nearly 70 years after independence. We still have reservations in India today, because of course it became transparent within a few years that a 10-year reservation policy was going to do absolutely nothing at all. So you have, for example, in India, you have had Prevention of Atrocities Against Untouchables bill, subsequently passed by the Legislative Assembly, and therefore it becomes an act, so it becomes a piece of legislation. For years, not a single person was ever prosecuted against under the provisions of that act. And when I say atrocities against Dalits, I'm speaking about numerous kinds of atrocities. I'm speaking about the fact that you might have an entire village of Dalits that gets torched by upper caste landlords because of a conflict between the two groups. I'm talking obviously about the rape of Dalit women. Okay? I'm talking about the fact that in many parts of India, the Dalits do not have access to water. So let's say you have a village and you have only one supply of water there, a well. And the upper caste use that well, a Dalit will not be permitted to use that well to draw water. So that Dalit might have to travel 10, 15 miles before they get to the next source of water. Right? That's what I mean, very briefly, yes.
Do people actually prevent them from using the well?
Oh yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, this is not, we're not saying that this happens in every village, in every district, in every state, but the scale of atrocities is really immense. And what I'm saying is that immediately in the aftermath, okay, in the aftermath of independence, when you have attempts to prevent atrocities, when you have an attempt to in fact actually say that we're going to abolish untouchability altogether, in the aftermath of that, nothing for years ever really happened. And I mean, these are very good gestures. These are very, very good gestures, but effectively nothing really happened. So the question now was, how do you redress this problem? So one way you redress this problem is you say, well, let's pass all of these pieces of legislation. The other way you redress the problem, something that in fact I had mentioned in this class on a previous occasion when I was discussing the whole question of education, was you say, well, we're going to reserve a certain percentage of seats in institutions of higher education for Dalits. So for Delhi University, where I taught for a year, is a very good illustration of that. And incidentally, by the way, the standards of admission for Dalits are not going to be the same as the standards of admission for other candidates. So you have what are called general seats, and then you have what are called reserved seats. Okay, so let's supposing that the cutoff is 95%, that in order to get admitted to one of Delhi University's leading colleges in the subject of physics or chemistry or history, whatever the case might be, you say that the cutoff mark is 95%. Because when I say the cutoff mark, what I mean is that there is a nationwide exam, by the way, for admission into colleges. I'm not talking about something like the SAT. I'm talking about a nationwide exam which covers a huge range of fields. Basically, it's this exam that you take when you pass out of high school, before you get your high school diploma. Okay? So you might say the cutoff mark is 95% for admission to a general seat. But for an admission to the reserved seat, the cutoff mark might be 75%. That if the candidate has scored 75% marks on his or her exam, they are entitled to a seat in that particular college, in that particular subject, whatever the subject may be. But what they found, of course, was that, well, if you're going to reserve so many seats in institutions of higher education, the problem is you need to have enough candidates coming out of that community. But if Dalits do not even have access to high schools, to secondary education, to primary education, what are the prospects that you're going to be able to find enough candidates to be able to move them into institutions of higher education? And when I say reservations, I'm not speaking about reservations only in institutions of education, in colleges and universities. I'm also speaking about reservations in government jobs, in government institutions, in the civil services, for example. Right? So this is what I mean when I speak about the abolition of untouchability and reservations and the issue of caste, but we'll look at some of this in slightly greater detail. I know there might be a question or two, but I can't take it right now because I've got a huge amount of material that I really need to move through. All right? Now, if I may just wrap up with this section, take a little bit more time, because I want to move on to the next section after that, and within the whole ambit of politics, and that is India's relations with neighboring states. So the question of the integrity of the Indian nation and the imposition of the emergency, all of this is something that I want to direct your attention to for a moment. I'm going to have to move to a different PowerPoint to do that for a second, so just give me a minute when I find the right slides to be able to show you what I have in mind over there. Okay. All right. So if you look at this map over here, I have spoken to you very briefly about the conflict over Kashmir between India and Pakistan, a conflict that continues down to the present day. Its origins obviously go back to 1947. Well, if you had the long-term view, then its origins go back much earlier. And recall what the situation in Kashmir was in 1947, that you had a Hindu ruler, a Hindu Maharaja, presiding over a largely Muslim population. All right? Now, in itself, by the way, that's not necessarily a reason for conflict. I mean, there's no reason why we should assume that that's in itself a reason for conflict. And there are various kinds of complexities if we wanted to enter into a long-term discussion of what the Kashmir situation is about. So, for example, when we say that the vast majority of the population of Kashmir was Muslim, this, of course, ignores the fact that in Kashmir, if you look at the end of the first millennium, so let's say the 9th century, 10th century, moving into the second millennium, the 11th century, 12th century, 13th century, and so on, Shaivism is a branch of Hinduism, was the predominant religion. And when you have had a religion for a substantial period of time, it in various ways informs the culture and sensibility of the people. Okay? So, in other words, if you look at the history of Kashmir, you could say, well, it's predominantly Muslim. Yes, it is predominantly Muslim. But the question here is whether different strands had not entered into this area and had then left their impression. So this area here, for example, called Ladakh, this is predominantly Buddhist. It's predominantly Buddhist. Right? So Kashmir is not singular. You can't say that it has only a Muslim identity. And then when you move down to this part here, to Jammu, okay, so the state is, by the way, called Jammu and Kashmir, and it's called Jammu and Kashmir because you have this part here called Jammu, and then you have the larger area which is called Kashmir. And we'll see what's happened to Kashmir over here, because if you look at this map, and for those of you already looking at it carefully, you'll see that there are various parts that are occupied by other people. Okay, so you have this portion here. So that border that you see in red over here, this is what the traditional boundary of the state of Jammu and Kashmir used to be. All right, and then if you look at the portion over here on the top where you see the red lines there, so this is a portion of Kashmir which is now occupied by China. Okay, and I can't get into the circumstances under which that happened, because we really have to obviously have a detailed lecture on exactly what has been the history of Kashmir from 1947 all the way to the present. And then you have the northern area, and I'll show you a few more maps which will give you a bit more detail about that, but you have the northern portion of it which is now in the hands of Pakistan. And this dotted line here, I don't know how clearly you can see it, this is what is called the LOC. There are lots of Hindi movies that have been made on the LOC. LOC means line of control. So this is effectively the border between India and Pakistan that was agreed upon by the countries in the aftermath of 1971. Okay, at the end of the war in December 1971. Now this lower portion, Jammu here, this is predominantly Hindu and Sikh. Hindu and Sikh. Okay, but although when you get to the western portion of it, you will start to get a greater Muslim population. Right? This is the situation we're talking about. Now, I want you to leave aside Kashmir for a second and think about a number of other considerations. So we're saying there was a problem there, but there were in fact problems on the borders on the northeast as well. This is on the northwest. Right? And for those of you who have been keeping up with Indian affairs for a few years, you may be dimly aware of the fact that in fact India has an equally strong military presence on the northeast frontier as it does on its borders on the northwest. Right? And I'm going to show you a map of that which will make it clear to you, but I simply alert you to this fact because what I'm trying to suggest to you is that when I talk about the, quote, integrity of the Indian nation, what we're talking about is, well, how does a country actually secure its borders? And how does it secure its borders when the people at the borders belong to very different strands of culture? They embody different linguistic traditions, different religious traditions very often. Right? These are some of the considerations that are going to be paramount. And these questions became paramount immediately after 1947, because when the question of the integration of the Indian Union was before before Nehru and the leadership of the Indian Congress Party in the aftermath of independence, the question was, well, what exactly is it that makes it possible to put all of these people together and say that, well, they're all Indians? Right? What is it that they might possibly have in common, and how are we going to actually secure these borders? So if you look at the subsequent slides over here, we're going to look through them very briefly. So this is a territory here ceded by Pakistan to China in 1963. And this territory is claimed by India, right? So we're moving the arrow over there. Then the northern area, so this is a line of control here that you see here. So this is effectively the border between India and Pakistan. And here it says Azad Kashmir over here. Azad Kashmir means free Kashmir. However, this is not what the Indians call it. This is what the Pakistanis call it. The Indians call it Pakistan occupied Kashmir. Okay? So they've occupied this portion. Okay? So it says India-China line of actual control. This is the Vale of Kashmir. This is the Valley of Kashmir. This is the most obviously prized territory, and of course it's squarely in India, and the capital there is Srinagar over there. Okay, Siachen Glacier over there. Interesting The glacier here is at a height of approximately 21,000 feet. 21,000 feet. It has been estimated that it costs both the Pakistani government and the Indian government approximately $5 million per soldier to maintain troops there. And they've got troops there. Why do they have so many troops there? Because there's absolutely nothing at 21,000 feet. Right? The Siachen Glacier. I mean, there are more soldiers who have died from frostbite than they have from bullets at this altitude. And they've had a standing army. I'm not talking about a huge army there at the glacier itself, a standing army at the borders, yes, of course. But they've had a standing force, both Pakistan and India, for decades, okay, at the Siachen Glacier. And Aksai China is then the portion of Pakistan which is now in the hands of, a portion of Kashmir which is now in the hands of China. Okay. So, we don't need to look at these maps here because these more or less go over the same terrain. But this one here, by the way, is interesting because what it does is it gives you a breakdown of this area in terms of religion. And so you can see when I said that Jammu there is predominantly Hindu, so that's a portion at the bottom that's in blue over there. And then Ladakh here, which is in this brownish color, this here is predominantly Buddhist. And when we say predominantly Hindu or predominantly Buddhist, we mean exactly that there may obviously be adherents of other religions in very small numbers because the populations tend to be quite mixed. Okay, and then this whole area in green here, this is where the population is predominantly Muslim. All right. Now let's turn our attention very briefly to northeast India. Okay, so we're talking about the other end of the country. So you've got these states over there, Arunachal Pradesh, Manipur, Mizoram, Tripura, Meghalaya. What can we say about these states? Nagaland here, which is, and in fact actually the original problem started with Nagaland because the Nagas really share most of their features with the Burmans. So here is Myanmar. Myanmar is the other name for Burma, right? And you know that Burma was part of the British Empire and administered through India. So in 1947, among the problems that the Indian government found it difficult to contain was the problem of what to do with the Nagas, because they were now going to be assimilated into the Indian Union. But the languages that are spoken in this part of the country are neither Aryan languages or Indo-European languages, nor are they Dravidian languages, which are the two major linguistic groups that account for the bulk of the languages spoken in India. Right? So languages such as Hindi, Gujarati, Marathi, Bengali, these are all Indo-European languages. And then if you recall what I mentioned to you in one of my opening lectures, that the languages spoken in South India, these are what are called the Dravidian languages. Now these are Tibeto-Burman languages. Right? They don't share very many features with the languages spoken in the rest of India. Most of these people would have been neither Hindu nor Muslim. Now you've had proselytization going on there, and this has irked the Hindu nationalists, because the Hindu nationalists do not really want proselytization here. And when I say proselytization here, I'm talking largely about Christian missionaries. Right? Of course, you had Christian missionary activity in the rest of India as well, because India was under colonial rule. But that's obviously speaking about India in the colonial period. Now we're speaking about India in the post-1947 period down to the present day, where we're saying that there has been Christian missionary activity. And of course, I'm looking at it in the singular because there are many different kinds of Christians. We're not differentiating between the different denominations and sects at this point in time. But there's obviously some concern. The question really here simply is this: why is it that you had this kind of proselytization here? Partially because the area was neither really Hinduized nor Islamicized. Right? That's the principal reason. Because obviously if Hinduism had had a long-standing presence in this area, then it's very unlikely that you would have had such kind of proselytization. And these are all tribal groups for the most part. right? And then, of course, we're talking about immense linguistic diversity. Immense linguistic diversity. There's been also some, in recent months, for example, in the city of Delhi, in the capital, there have been some incidents of what are being described as racially motivated attacks against people from Northeast India who have now come into places like Delhi or other metropolitan centers. And you've got substantial number of people who have moved from Northeast India into what you might describe as mainland India. The principal reason for that, of course, is that the prospects for jobs and employment prospects are much better. I mean, if you've got students from Northeast India who want to acquire a higher education, generally what will they do? They will go to Delhi or Bombay or Bangalore. They'll go to one of the larger cities. Okay? But this entire area has been an area of what might be described as insurgencies. Okay? Insurgencies. This map here, you'll see an insurgency map in just a few moments, but what this map does is it gives you basically the breakdown in terms of language. So here it says Tibeto-Burman. You see that's so the portion in green over there, that entire area, the languages that are spoken belong to the Tibeto-Burman family, and then you've got a portion here in purple here. This is the Austro-Asiatic family, linguistic family, and then you've got the Indo-Aryan or Indo-European. The reason for that is because of the proximity to Bangladesh and therefore the influence of Bengali, which is an Indo-European language. All right, and here you see a map here now. So this is taken from an Indian magazine, which basically describes what might be understood as a series of insurrections or insurgencies that have taken place in this part of the country. Essentially, I would say really since independence, but particularly beginning in the 1960s down to the present day. So it says here since 1997 over 11,000 guerrillas have been housed in 63 designated camps in Assam, Nagaland, Manipur and Meghalaya. Now, in order to understand this, I need to introduce another word into our discussion here, and that is the word Naxalites. So who are the Naxalites, and why is it the case that much of this area is also supposed to be under heavy Naxalite influence? So there's a place in the state of Bengal. That place is called Naxalbari. And Naxalbari is essentially a village where, or a district where, in the late 1960s, a movement arose. Okay, the best way for you to think about the movement is that it's inspired by Maoism. Okay, by the teachings of Mao, by teachings of Chairman Mao, Mao Zedong. And essentially what the Maoists were advocating was radical land reform. Radical land reform. And they, of course, did not disavow the use of revolutionary violence. Right? So what would be a typical Maoist strategy? This might sound almost like a caricature, but it's useful as a caricature. That if you have conflict over land in a village or in a district, you incite the landless laborers to take over the property of the rich landlord. And if necessary, use violence to achieve your ends. Right? So this is what we are speaking about when we speak about the influence of Maoism in this area. And the reason why these people are called Naxalites is because this movement arose in this village, as I'm saying, called Naxalbari. So when you encounter the word Naxalites in readings having to do with India, think of Maoists. And the Naxalites, by the way, they operate largely outside the political party structure, but not entirely so. There are some splinter parties of the Communist Party. So you have a Communist Party in India. This party splintered, as many Communist parties did around the world, because of the breakup, because of the division between the Soviet Union and China. You know, for those of you who know your history of communism, you might recall that there was a split between China and the Soviet Union, a difference of ideology. So what happened in India was that the Communist Party of India split up, and then over the years you had further fragmentation. So right now, for example, there are over 30 political parties which represent the interests of the communists. Most of them have absolutely no representation in parliament at all. Okay, but nonetheless, I'm saying to you that even though the Naxalite movement should be understood as a largely extra-constitutional meaning outside the structure of the political parties, notwithstanding that there is still some splinter parties which actually do take part in politics. And politics, and that means electoral politics, which of course most of the Naxalites view as a kind of a bourgeois activity. So they have absolutely renounced electoral politics. Now, over the course of the last 4 decades, because recall when this insurrection arose in Naxalbari, well, almost 5 decades we're talking about right now, right? Over the course of the last 5 decades, these Naxalites have been able to exert substantial influence. In fact, the former Prime Minister of India, about 3 years ago, Manmohan Desai is a filmmaker. Manmohan Singh pointed out that the greatest threat to India was the Naxalite movement. Okay? And not an assessment necessarily that most people share, but this was, in any case, his perception of the problem. And it has very often been pointed out that the tribal populations of India, scattered throughout the country, all constitute part of what is called the Naxalite belt. So if you look at this map here, it's an interesting map. It's called the Red Corridor. Okay, the Red Corridor. Naxalite affected districts of India. So if you look at the portions that are in deep red, dark red, are severely affected districts. 51 districts, a tenth of the country, more than a tenth of the country. Right? And then if you look at the orange and the lighter shades, these are all districts which are affected but not severely affected, moderately affected, marginally affected, so forth and so on. And what we're talking about is what? We're not talking about a small portion of the country. We are saying virtually the entire eastern half of the country, at least according to the person who made up this map, is affected by Naxalite activity. And so when we say affected by Naxalite activity, what that means is that in some of these areas, the government of India or the state government is paralyzed. That effectively they do not run this place any longer. Their writ does not run in that place. Right? That's what it means. And we're talking about roughly 1/3 of the country. And most people who have looked at this problem, they also understand it as a problem that afflicts largely tribal populations. Now, what's the relationship? Why have the Naxalites been so influential in the tribal areas? They've been so influential in the tribal areas because these are the areas that were grossly neglected by the government of India or by the state governments. Right? Because in some casual sense, notwithstanding the critique of development as an ideology, obviously development in some commonsensical understanding of the term, that is, some form of social change. And when we say some form of social change, that means the advent of schools, the availability to healthcare, the availability of jobs, some integration into the local economy. In the tribal areas, none of that happened. And so what the Naxalite movement represents is an acute disenchantment with the Indian government. A widespread feeling in these areas that the Indian government and the state governments have been grossly negligent towards the people living in these areas. They've been grossly negligent because the tribals are seen, of course, as semi-civilized. They don't speak any of the languages that are Dravidian or the Indo-European languages. They tend to not follow the mainstream religions. Right? They come from largely local traditions. You've got lots of different tribal groups here. We're not speaking about one single tribal group. And of course, there may be acute differences between different tribal groups as well. But nonetheless, what they share in common is that they have been largely left out of the developments that have taken place in India in the post-1947 period. Right? So when we're speaking about the integrity of the Indian nation, and we're speaking about the different kinds of insurgencies and insurrections that have taken place, what do you have to bear in mind? You have to bear in mind, one, the problem of Kashmir. Number two, you have to bear in mind the entire northeast here, which is, of course, if you look at this map, so here you've got Bangladesh. We're going to come to that question later on, how it became Bangladesh. Right? But here you've got Bangladesh, which was East Pakistan before 1971, and then you've got this part of the country, which you can see is quite isolated from the rest of the country. Right? And this is, by the way, a highly mountainous region as well. So there are other kinds of considerations that come into play when you look at regions that are highly mountainous. Okay, so Kashmir, northeast India, where the Indian government has had a standing military presence, in a massive investment of military resources, and there have been a huge number of provocations in this kind of area. So for example, just to give you a very simple indication of the kind of provocation that I'm talking about, the Armed Forces Special Powers Act, as it's called, okay? Armed Forces Special Powers Act, okay, AFSPA. So this is a piece of legislation that was carried over from colonial India. Right? Something that you should remember. Many of the pieces of legislation that you have in India were pieces of legislation that existed in colonial times. And the Indian state just simply decided to carry over them after independence. So in 1942, the colonial state passed what was called the Armed Forces Special Powers Ordinance. And you know what an ordinance is? An ordinance is a special measure imposed by the executive branch of the government. All right? So for example, the President Obama can in fact pass an ordinance. It doesn't go through Congress. Right? Most countries, most democracies have something like that available. In 1947, after the attainment of independence, the Armed Forces Special Powers Ordinance was transformed into an act. And what does this act do? What this act does, very briefly, is it gives the people who are implementing that act immunity from prosecution. So let's say you've got troops in Nagaland, okay, here we have Kohima here, Nagaland. The Armed Forces Special Powers Act is in force in this state. Effectively, what does it do? You have an insurrection there. A number of villagers in a certain area rise up in revolt. But it's a non-violent revolt. Right? Non-violent revolt. The state decides to put it down using violence. Crush the rebellion. And atrocities are committed. Now what does the AFSPA, if that area is under the AFSPA, because the government has to declare that this area is now under the Armed Forces Special Powers Act. So if that area is under that act, and you've got soldiers who have committed atrocities, it gives them immunity from prosecution. They cannot be convicted. They cannot even be hauled before a court. That's what this act is. And one of the things that you find in Northeast India is the widespread use of this act by the Indian state. And of course, what the state has done, and this is typically what states do, democracies do it quite often, by the way. Right? What the state has done is they use the umbrella of this act to rope in people who have nothing to do with the disturbance that is taking place. So let's supposing you happen to be a human rights activist. You happen to be a human rights activist. You're working with a group of people there, and you're monitoring the situation, and they charge you under the AFSPA. You have virtually no recourse to legal action. And you certainly cannot take the people who have illegally hauled you into jail, you certainly cannot take them into court. If 3 years later you are released from court, you can't say, well, I'm going to file a lawsuit against them for illegal confinement in prison. You cannot do that. That's what the Armed Forces Special Powers Act does. And there has been a massive agitation in Northeast India, in those parts of Northeast India which have been brought under the AFSPA, to actually have this act removed. There was a very, very famous movement that took place where the women of Manipur, okay, they appeared at the headquarters of the military and stripped themselves completely in order to protest against this act. Because one of the things that was happening in this, under the jurisdiction of this act, is that people just disappear. You just disappear. When you've imposed draconian legislation of this kind, there's virtually no recourse left. Right? And so this was one way to try to do a non-violent protest to embarrass the government, and of course it became international news. Right? This particular protest that I'm talking about. So when we're looking at politics in India, and we're not looking, by the way, at external politics at all right now, we're simply looking at what's happening in India itself. And in this particular portion that is a discussion of the integrity of the Indian Union, what I've been talking about here is the difficulties of maintaining the Union. The threats as an Indian government has seen it, coming both from Kashmir, and we're not looking at the geopolitical position of Kashmir right now. We're not looking at jihadi movements and what's been happening in the last 20 years, not even remotely. Right? That will take us to a different level of discussion. But the insurrections in Kashmir, the problems in Northeast India, thirdly, the Naxalite movement, beginning here in West Bengal, and then gradually its ideological influence spreading throughout large portions of the country, okay, over the course of the last 5 decades. And fourthly, something that we're going to look at a little bit later on, little insurrections, hundreds and thousands of them, being undertaken by the Dalits. But that's something that we'll reserve our attention for a little bit later on. Okay, and this is the final map that you have here, which shows you again one person's perspective of the areas that have been highly affected. But you'll see that there is a basic agreement here between the person who drafted this map and the previous map, because this portion here, this is the portion of the country that is most highly affected. They put in a few pockets elsewhere too, correctly so, because you have populations here that are in fact actually heavily invested in the Naxalite movement as well. And when I say Naxalite movement, you should not think of this as a movement in the singular. It's not like that there is some central organization here and that this is being masterminded by one man or one committee. No. What we're speaking about is the fact that there are people who are disenchanted with the state, who feel that they have been grossly neglected, that their people have been grossly neglected over the course of the last 6-7 decades. And what you're seeing here is the consequences of that in India. Okay, and then we have the subject, finally, to get to the last thing, which is the management, number 8, management of communal conflict. Again, something on which I'm going to speak about in much greater detail later on, but what do I mean by that? What I mean by communal conflict is religious conflict. Okay, religious conflict between Hindus and Muslims, or between Hindus and Sikhs, or Muslim and Sikhs, anti-Christian violence, for example, in the state of Orissa, when the perception became widespread that there was proselytization going on by Christian missionaries, which the Hindu nationalists, of course, found unacceptable. But management here, I put in quotation marks, because very often the state takes the view that the state simply needs to learn how to manage, bring it under control, that the proportions of this conflict can be reduced. And of course, I think there are much more substantive issues which have to do with the nature of Hindu-Muslim relations, which would have to be addressed if one is going to look at the question of communal conflict. Now, let's look at the next segment of the politics of India in the post-1947 period. And a dispute over Kashmir, which I've already spoken about, war with Pakistan 1947-48, obviously over Kashmir, another war in 1965, and then one in 1971. And I want to dwell on that now before I move on to the other things. So what I want to look at in the remaining time today is to talk about the conflict that transpired in early 1971 and eventually led to the breakup of Pakistan. So recall what I had mentioned to you in my opening lectures. And this map is simply intended to refresh your memory about this extraordinarily anomalous position that was created in 1947 when Pakistan came into being, because one half of the country, the larger half of the country, was West Pakistan, and then you had East Pakistan on the eastern side, all right? And in between you have the landmass of India, right? This is the situation we're talking about. Now, it's useful to keep in mind a few things. That when we say West Pakistan, before we turn our attention to East Pakistan, because East Pakistan was comparatively, I shouldn't say comparatively more homogeneous, but that the bulk of the population would be Bengalis. Whereas in West Pakistan, what you have effectively is you have, let me see if I can find the right map over here. So if you look at this map over here, okay, so and this is a map that doesn't give you the district-wise district breakdown in Pakistan. What it does, it gives you the breakdown by provinces. So these are the major provinces or the major areas. So you've got Punjab, okay, and I would say that the Punjabi identity has been critical to the shaping of Pakistan. And then you've got Sindh, and the major city there is Karachi, which is a port city, right? And then you've got Balochistan. And by the way, there is a massive insurrection going on in Balochistan. So there are attempts to create what is called a free Balochistan. And then you have the federally administered tribal areas called FATA, usually. So if you see the acronym FATA, that's what it refers to. This is a large tract of land. You can see it's fairly large, which frankly no one has really mapped adequately. Okay, it's almost like a no man's land. And if you look at the recent discussions that have taken place about the Taliban in Pakistan, I don't know how many of you are aware that there was an explosion, a suicide bomber at the border between India and Pakistan just 48 hours ago. More than 50 people killed. Okay. Now, it is generally viewed that many of the people who are hospitable to one of the Taliban type groups, I say one of the Taliban type groups because there's not one single group there. People who have actually studied what's happening there, and frankly, I don't think anyone really knows. Okay? But people who have actually studied what's happening there, we're talking about 40, 50 different organizations and groups there. Okay? But one of the major organizations there is what is very often referred to simply as the Pakistan Taliban. And FATA is important here because it is generally viewed that places like the federally administered tribal areas are places that are hospitable to elements from these groups, and that it is virtually impossible to track down what's happening there. This is a terrain that is highly mountainous, has not been charted out. Right? So when Bush very loudly and proudly proclaimed that we're going to smoke him out, Osama, remember? 15 years ago, almost 15 years ago, right? One of the difficulties in smoking him out is precisely that they are clueless about what's going on in this portion of the country and in Afghanistan. But this is nonetheless what we call FATA, and then you have the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, which is a recent name. This used to be known as the Northwest Frontier Province, okay? The NWFP. An extraordinary history. Because the Pathans, it's also now useful to think about how is this divided linguistically. Okay, so in the Punjab, the predominant language, of course, is going to be Punjabi and Urdu, right? And Urdu, as some of you here certainly know, is similar to Hindi. In fact, many people would argue it's exactly the same language, it's just that it's written in two different scripts. And we can make further differentiations, and I want to talk a little bit about that just for a minute so that you understand the politics of what is happening here. Okay, so we've got Hindi and Urdu, and then we have a language which is effectively what most people really speak in this part of Pakistan and what they speak effectively in North India, in places like Delhi where I come from. So we have got Hindi, and we've got Urdu, and we've got Hindustani. Okay? This is the language. Then we can talk about the script. So Hindustani, one way to understand it is the following. All right? Just try to understand what's happening here, because this is not a very common situation. And what I'm saying to you very simply is this, that this is India here, right? This is India here. This is the border. That in the Punjab over here, and in large tracts of north and central India, the 500 million people roughly who speak Hindi, that these 500 million people who speak Hindi, they can be perfectly well understood in this part of Pakistan. And similarly, the people who are living here can be understood by the people living in India. However, the languages are known by two different names. So in Pakistan, it's referred to as Urdu, and in India, it's referred to as Hindi. Effectively, it's the same language for the most part, and we'll see what the differentiation is. And very often, from the point of view of a linguist, that language, which is really common, is actually what we speak. It's neither Hindi nor Urdu, and that is called Hindustani. Hindustani. Now, what is the distinction? Other than the fact that I cannot read the Urdu script as a Hindi speaker unless I learn the script. And similarly, most Pakistanis who speak Urdu, they can understand Hindi, but they cannot read it, because it's written in a different script. It's written in what is called the Nagri script or Devanagari script. Okay, and of course the script of Urdu is similar to Arabic. It derived from there, right? Now, what are the circumstances in which this linguistic situation gets complicated? The simplest illustration would be when, for example, war breaks out between India and Pakistan. Okay, so I'm sitting in India, and I want to listen to what a Pakistani news channel is saying about the war. Now, usually, I can understand what Pakistanis are saying, because remember that we are both, that I'm a Hindi speaker, they're Urdu speaker, but that common language, 90% of which is common, is called Hindustani. However, during the time of war, what happens, and there may be other times when these things happen too, but this is a very good illustration of where the language is now going to change, very deliberately. In the time of war, what happens is people become patriotic. So what do? In India, that Hindustani becomes much more Sanskritic. Much more Sanskritic. That is that because Hindustani is a language which derives some of its elements from Arabic and Persian, and some of its elements from Indian languages, such as Sanskrit. So the Hindustani that is being spoken in India will become much more Sanskritized. So you start introducing words that somebody in Pakistan is not going to recognize at all. Similarly, in Pakistan, at a time of conflict, what happens there? The Hindustani becomes much more Arabicized. They're going to use words which will seldom be used in ordinary conversation. And the reason they do that is because they're now increasing the social distance. Right? That's what one of the things that languages do. Many people actually don't understand it. They think that languages are meant to actually narrow the gap. Well, not always. Sometimes they're meant to increase the social distance between different groups. Right? Which is why, for example, if an African American feels that, hey, he doesn't want to be really co-opted into mainstream white American society, he's going to speak a kind of a dialect or lingo, if I may put it this way, which if you grew up in an affluent household and speaking absolutely correct English, you wouldn't understand half of it. Because what that person is trying to do is they're trying to create a social distance. So in this case, what's happening is that the social distance becomes greater when there's conflict. And it's echoed in the language. And when things are much more harmonious, then you make that social distance narrower. You bridge that gap. Okay? So this is the situation that you have to think about when you're looking at the linguistic situation of South Asia, particularly with respect to Hindi, Urdu, and Hindustani. Now let me just complete my train of thought here, take a minute. And we're not done with this, we're going to have to continue with this obviously because we haven't gotten to the roots of the conflict in 1971 that led to the creation of Bangladesh, right? But I'm saying if you look at Pakistan itself, what you have here is Punjabi speaking, the military in Pakistan, and the military is all powerful. That's one big difference with India. I mean, no matter what anyone says about whether India is a democracy or not, one way in which you judge whether a country is a democracy or not is you see whether there is a substantial gap between civilian authority, civil power, and military power. Okay? And in India, there is that gap. In Pakistan, unfortunately, there isn't. The military has been the dominant instrument in the last 6.5 decades in Pakistan. No question about it. Okay? And most of the military in Pakistan is derived from the ranks of the Punjabis. Okay? Then you've got Sindh, which is Sindhi speaking, different language. Different language. And again, I don't want anyone to walk away with the impression that, well, if you're a Sindhi, it means that you know only Sindhi. Of course not. You would still be fluent in Urdu, many of them. Not all of them. Many of them would be. Okay, and then Baluchistan, again, linguistically different. And similarly, you've got Pakhtunkhwa, the Pathans, speaking Pashto. Okay? And by the way, there are other groups there as well, but we're just looking at, you know, the predominant breakup here. And we're going to look very briefly in my next lecture at the Pathans as well. And then you've got, by the way, Islamabad Capital Territory. So Islamabad is a capital, and like in many other countries in the world, such as the United States, where Washington, D.C., as you know, has a special status, right? Australia, Canberra has a special status. New Delhi in India, special status. So similarly, Islamabad Capital Territory, that's the capital there. And then you have what is called Azad Jammu and Kashmir. That's that portion of Kashmir which is now in Pakistan, in the hands of what the Indian government would call Pakistan occupied Kashmir, right? That's and then Gilgit-Baltistan is the northernmost end of Pakistan. Right, so this is the breakup of Pakistan itself, but we're going to continue with this in my subsequent lecture.